understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Podcast time. I hope you are well, and we are going to talk about the dilapidation of Dublin City, but not just Dublin City. Dublin City being emblematic of inner cities all around, frankly, the English-speaking world, which was a function of white flight, which was white middle-class people leaving in the American, definitely in the 70s and 80s, into the suburbs, general lack of care, general lack of love. And what you get is cities that are dangerous, dark, unappealing, and you get a self-reinforcing negative cycle into which cities are sucked, so much so that parts of the inner city, certainly of Dublin, and we're talking about this a year after the riots in Dublin, almost a year after the riots in Dublin, which took people by surprise, but also focused people's attention on the centre of the city. John's attention is unfortunately not in the centre of the city, but is on his jaw because you've just had your wisdom teeth out.
I did. I had one wisdom tooth out, an amputation of my head.
Amputation, exactly. An aggressive amputation.
Yes, but my jaw is killing me. It just feels weird. I don't know the last time you had a tooth out. I haven't had one out since I was a kid. But it's just like there's a big hole in my head. That's what it feels like.
And the problem is the tongue naturally gravitates towards the hole in the head.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So I'm eating soft food now.
I know. Yeah, exactly. Give him a diet of jellies
More
and
porridge,
ice cream.
please.
More porridge, please. But you're hilarious, Davis. There never is a week goes by without some sort of crisis or mini crisis or health scare or whatever. Anyway, I was sitting, John, at the bar of this podcast came to me.
Well, rarely a day goes by you're not sitting at a bar.
I was sitting at the bar of the Boar's Head on Capel Street.
Right. Nice.
Which is an old boozer. Yeah, just there on the corner, going down towards Smithfield. And I was talking to a mate of mine, and the barman, Ken, and we were discussing just generally the centre of the city, what's going on, etc. And of course, the Boar's Head would be very typical of a lot of pubs. In the day, there'd be mainly tourists coming in, but they disappear at night, of course, or they tend to be basically replaced. But his point was, and it's the same, I presume, for the Boar's Head, for Slattery's, all those sort of pubs all around there, is that the trade has changed completely. The local element, which kept pubs alive, local people having a drink, has changed. It's now tourist, and it's sort of a microcosm of what's happening in the city, simply because if you build hotels every time there's a space, what you're going to do is you're going to, by definition, get less residents, more tourists. And the problem with cities is that cities require citizens. It's actually, the clue is in the word, right? The citizen lives in the city, right? That's why cities are not called touries. It's not about tourists, right? It's about citizens, okay? Back to our, do you remember we talked about the agora, John, in ancient Athens?
Yeah.
The agora was the beating heart of the city of Athens, and it was the marketplace that was thriving, not just with commerce, but with ideas, with notions, with trade, with literature, with politics, with people shouting and roaring. The agora was the central meeting point of the citizens of the city. And Dublin and other English-speaking cities need to reclaim that, and need to really recapture it, because what you see is that, yes, Dublin needs more guards. Yes, Dublin needs more of almost every public servant, right? But in the main, what it absolutely needs is to be repopulated, and not just repopulated by transient immigrants. It has to be repopulated with a mix of people who reflect the actual society. So you don't end up getting, in effect, immigrant ghettos in the center of the city, which is the way in which Dublin is going.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have to stop that. Simply because if you get that, you get areas become stratified into ethnic minorities, and suddenly then you have all sorts of problems. So as I was walking from the Boar's Head up Capel Street and up towards, Dorset Street, I was just going for a little stroll
Yeah.
around, right? It just
Yeah.
struck me that the work of Jane Jacobs, who is this amazing, and again, I'd advise listeners to, if you're interested in urban regeneration, urban planning, the economics of cities, how cities have created civilizations, Jane Jacobs, just Google her. Anything she's written is interesting.
Yeah.
But her basic idea was that the most creative, livable, sustainable city in terms of how it mixed development and people and
Yeah.
commerce and residential was the West Village and East Village in Manhattan. And they were threatened in the 1960s by a large city hall project to drive, in effect, a freeway through the bottom of Manhattan.
Right.
She was a housewife who started to say, well, hold on a second, this is ridiculous. And then she started to actually write about urbanism, but she wrote about how cities actually work as opposed to how they ought to work, right? So the
Yeah.
planners came from the idea that this is how they ought to work. This is how they should work in an ideal world. And she was like, no, cities are messy, evolutionary things. So she said, let's look at how cities actually work. And she introduced 4 basic ideas into how self-sustaining cities work. And I'm just going to read them to you, John, because they're very interesting.
too.
So her first idea, right, was that every vibrant, enjoyable city requires, the first one is permeability. And by this, she meant that roads, walkways, pedestrian pathways, etc., should all be interconnected. And they offer a kind of a varied way of getting from A to B. And her whole idea was walkability without dead ends or cul-de-sacs, etc., was actually essential. Now, of course, all this, John, is framed by our friend Joyce and Bloom, because we wouldn't have Ulysses if Bloom couldn't walk around the city. So Bloom was the original urban planner, okay? He was the
Here comes Joyce
flaneur.
again.
No, but that's the great expression, flaneur.
Yeah.
I think Nassim Taleb, who's coming down to Kilconomics, describes himself as a flaneur. Somebody just flans around the city, reading and engaging with people.
I want one of those jobs.
Yeah, we both wanted to flan, right? So
Is that the same for Flan O'Brien? Does it come from Flaneur O'Brien?
It should. Except you went around the boys.
Okay.
Her second one was mixed use, right? That basically everything has to be mixed. You need residential. When you're rezoning an area, you need residential, commercial, and retail. And this, she said, was essential for creating a sense of community and identity in an area rather than one homogenous idea, like it's rezoned just for commercial, right? So, for example, in Dublin, you have the beautiful Merrion Square, which is an entirely dead zone because it is zoned entirely for commercial. So it's full of lawyers' offices and accountants' offices, and at 5 o'clock it's empty.
Yeah.
No other city.
But it was originally designed for residential.
Absolutely.
Totally.
And it should be redesigned. So again, the planning needs to try and catch up with the fact that, so the south side of Dublin, you have far too much commercial stuff. Ironically, the north side of Dublin, you have far too much retail stuff. That all around O'Connell Street, the bottom floors are all retail. You have lots and lots of shops. Problem with shops is people come in to shop, but then they leave when they stop shopping. So those areas like Henry Street, O'Connell Street, they are dead after 5 o'clock because the shops are closed. And her idea was it needs to be mixed use. And of course, her basic idea was that the more mixed use you have, the more different types of people you'll have in there. She also said her 4th big idea is that cities should be crammed. They should be dense. So residential and commercial should be interlinked tightly. So there shouldn't be big open spaces between roads and streets and offices and apartment blocks. They need to be dense. And then this led to her 4th idea, right, which she called natural surveillance. And her idea was that you should build buildings between 6 and 8 stories maximum, because anything higher than that, the people who live on the 20th floor get completely isolated from what's going on the street. And her main idea was the streets are the sort of veins of the city that carry the blood around, that carry the energy around. And so people have to be really connected with the streets. And her other idea was that the more, and this is interesting, the more people you have living on the streets, the more they police their own streets because they have a stake in the place. And actually, the less
Sure, yeah.
guards you need, the
Yeah.
less cops you need, right?
But can I just say, I mean, that all sounds fantastic and idyllic and all the rest. If you were designing a city from scratch, but like our city, Dublin, and the likes of London or Barcelona or whatever, they were designed many years ago and are
Yeah.
just kind of building on top of the original design. So it's kind of hard to, jam all those points into.
You're absolutely right. It's like anything. If you start with a blank slate, the vast majority of human endeavor wouldn't end up looking like it ends up now, right? If you start
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
because things have changed. But you can still enmesh these ideas into your vision of or for the city, that you need more people. So that means more apartments, more houses, more homes, more apartments that are 2-bed, more apartments that are 3-bed for families, little more homes, little streets, all this
Mm.
sort of stuff can be reimagined. But the first thing you have to do is rekindle what I would call love, care, affection for these areas, right? And that can happen in a variety of ways. But if we look at the way in which cities have evolved over years, you see that parts of cities that used to be abandoned and were edgy and were dangerous, have transformed themselves. Like I remember in the 80s, very first time I was in Berlin, the area of Kreuzberg, which is
Yeah.
now unbelievably hip and vibrant and cultural and exciting and all that sort of stuff, was really, really regarded as beyond the pale. So Kreuzberg, the very first time I stayed in Kreuzberg, I stayed in a hostel on our Dorky United football trip to Berlin in 1982. And because we could only afford the cheapest hostels because we were schoolboys going on a football trip. We
Yeah.
stayed in Kreuzberg, right? And we walked around it, right? But then it was preserved really of big Turkish community. And every now and then, like David Bowie and Brian Eno would rock up and Iggy Pop and make it kind of hip. Then they'd feck
Yeah,
off
yeah.
again. And
Yeah.
the vast majority of West Berliners who live in Charlottenburg or Steglitz or even Dahlem and all those areas, they would say, Kreuzberg, it's only for visiting at night. You go to a club there, but you get the hell out of there. Or you go to a
Yeah.
bar that we don't live there, right? Now the opposite is the case. An example that a lot of people will know is Hackney in London, in East London.
Mm.
Again, I knew Hackney in the 90s from playing football in the Hackney Marshes, John. And the Hackney
Yeah.
Marshes,
I knew it
remember that?
well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I lived around Westbourne Grove, going to Hackney was like going to Norwich or something. Like it was,
Of
you know what I mean?
course,
Like it
you
was,
lived in Westbourne Grove. That was
of
the
course
hip
it did.
place at the time. Yeah.
I know, yeah, exactly.
I was a South London boy.
I know. Well, I mean, I would never go Seth for the water. And I used to play with all these lads, these traders, and they were like proper cockneys. And when you play football with them, it's all apples and pears. But we used to play football in the Hackney Marshes on a Sunday morning. And Hackney then was, it was miles away and it was really, really desolate. And it was as far from West London as you can imagine. Today, Hackney is the place where all the kids want to live.
Yeah, it's and Dalston is another place like that. And my daughter, he was living SAF over the last year in Elephant and Castle, and Elephant and Castle was also one of those places that you didn't go because there was nothing there. It was grimy, it was rough, and it was dodgy. But now it's completely regenerated. Fantastic new apartment blocks, and there's a vibe to it. And that whole area of Bermondsey and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of vibing again.
The only thing I remember about Elephant and Castle was raves in the 90s.
Yes,
Under
yes.
the arches. Do you remember under the arches there? Right.
Yeah,
okay. Now let us move on from dance culture and football in the Hackney Marshes. But what has happened in London, what has happened in Berlin, what has happened in Paris is those areas, like the North Inner City today in Dublin, that were regarded as unsafe, downwardly mobile, dilapidated, etc., have now turned themselves around. So the key thing, John, is it can be done. This is what I want to cover, right? The idea that Dublin 1 has become shorthand for dereliction, for vandalism, for perceptions of crime, for immigrants on the streets, for homelessness, for drug addiction, etc., etc., etc. That was exactly what the Kreuzbergs, even the Hackneys of this world had a reputation for,
Yeah.
20 years ago. And as you said, that's changed. So the question is, what do they do? How can it change? And how can, I suppose after the break, John, how can we conceive of the centre of Dublin? I happen to think that the centre of Dublin could quite easily be one of the most happening addresses in Europe, where people will want to flock to, like a bit like Kreuzberg.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's consider this after the break.
Mac, you were just talking about Berlin there. I was watching a TV program Montcalm McGann is doing as he's traveling across Europe to various different cities. It's really good, actually. But I just caught a bit of it when he was in Kreuzberg in Berlin. And as you described it, it's kind of funky and gritty and all the rest. But one of his guests was saying that they're deliberately keeping it kind of gritty and a bit down at heel with kind of dog poo on the streets and graffiti and all the rest, deliberately to keep the kind of gentrification of the area and keep the prices down. They don't want the cool
I love
people
it.
in there.
It's quite funny. It's kind of the opposite of MAGA. It's Mixa. Make Kreuzberg shite again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. They
But-
don't want
but-
those
but-
Westbourne Grove kind of people coming in.
Are just general West Berliners. Now stop that, right? But the interesting thing about all these places that used to have one reputation now have another reputation, that used to be places you didn't want to live in are now places you want to live in. And that, I suppose, is the holy grail of all urban planning, is to change the points of reference about an area from a place you didn't want to go to a place where you want to go. So Kreuzberg, the interesting about Kreuzberg, that is a problem of success.
Yeah.
This is exactly what Dublin 1 would love to have, which is, how do we prevent so many people coming here rather than what it has now?
Actually, on the other hand as well, I wonder what Jane Jacobs would have make of the likes of Barcelona and the residents. Barcelona is quite densely populated.
It's very densely populated.
Yeah, of Barcelonians living in the city, but they don't want this tourist.
They don't want tourists,
at all, and they're really kicking off against it. What would Jane Jacobs make of that?
She'd be really against mass tourism. Tourism destroys everything it touches.
But it's a huge income for us.
It is and it isn't. It's a huge income for bars and hotels, right? But again, what we're talking about is, how do you create a city for citizens, not for tourists? I mean, if you're building hotels all the time and not building rooms, homes for people, all you have then is people coming in, day trippers, etc., which is, I think, what the Barcelonians and the people in Amsterdam are all saying. You know what? We have enough tourists. We're done with tourism, because tourism edges out rental accommodation. It's like the Airbnb approach as well. When Airbnb first started, it was like, wow, this is a really interesting way of staying on people's couches, in a sense, because the Airbnb was actually an airbed, right? That's what it came from. But, over time, if all rental properties are hoovered up by Airbnb because it's more profitable to rent out in the short term to tourists rather than to actually long term to residents and to tenants, what you have, of course, is a massive destruction of the local rental market, and prices go through the roof, and then only very wealthy can, all that sort of stuff. So I think, to answer your question on Jane Jacobs, I'd say she would be against mass tourism. And I think that's a pretty self-evident place to start, that tourism can never replace citizens. The tourist and the locals are not one and the same thing. And in fact, at a certain level, they are in competition with each other. And the problem is the tourist will always win. Why? Because the tourist will have more dollars in his or her back pocket, simply because they're going to Dublin for an event. You know?
Yeah.
So I think that if you look at, for example, the way in which your other cities have developed, they have developed because somebody at the top said, okay, we're going to change. We're going to actually figure something out. Now, in North Inner City Dublin and in South Inner City Dublin, but particularly North Inner City Dublin, you have widespread, as we know, dilapidation, vacancies. We have unsightlies. Those row of teeth that you had that were lovely pearls, with straight, That is
Yes.
the metaphor. It's the metaphor for a Dublin street or John's teeth, right? All holes and bits
Derelict
plucked
teeth.
out, vacant lots in the back of your jaw, right? So the question is, what do you do? And there has been in the last couple of years, about 15 years, a dramatic increase in what's called meanwhile use. And
Yeah.
it's a part of the planning. It's a sort of a loophole in planning, which basically says, so what is happening to all these sites is that developers are buying up sites, acquiring sites, hoarding sites in order for in the future to create something that will make them a fortune, right?
Yeah.
Sometime in the future, right? This meanwhile use says, well, in the meantime, between now and then, what you should do, could do, be encouraged to do is make those sites available for short-term lets, for things they call socially beneficial activities.
All right.
Galleries,
Pop-up shops
cultures,
and
pop-up
pop-up
shops,
galleries. Yeah.
pop-up bars, all that sort of stuff, right? To get people back in, working, living, etc., right? Now, meanwhile, a good way of looking at it is, do you remember all the furniture that popped up during the pandemic in various parts of Dublin? Okay, the street furniture, that the council put in to said, when you couldn't socialize, you were going to go out for your drink with your mates and sit around, right, out in the fresh air. A lot of that furniture would have been, believe it or not, contravening planning laws of some form or other. And under the meanwhile use clause, they were allowed to remain in place. And they are still in place and people are still using them, right? So that's a good idea to get your head around what it is. They've used it really extensively in London. And part of what you saw down in South London, Bermondsey and all that, and in Hackney, part of the vibrancy, the pop-up nature, the messiness of London has been using this meanwhile use. And again, why not Dublin? Like if Hackney can be, and you said Dalston and those parts of London can be completely turned around with a little nudge here and there, again, I don't see why we can't do the same thing in Dublin. There's a government task force, I think it's this week, and they suggested like moving RTE to the GPO. I think it's a great idea.
I wonder how would it all fit in there though?
But again, what you would do is it will be a signal to the centre of O'Connell Street that we are putting a massive public entity called RTE in there. And we're shifting the national conversation back. And that again, those sort of symbolic things are important. And bring you to O'Connell Street. And this for non-Irish listeners is a little bit Irishy, so we'll be brief. But a company called Hammerson has been building up a portfolio of property on north side of O'Connell Street, which is our main thoroughfare in Ireland, the main street of the capital city. They now have a 5.5 acre site from Moore Street to Parnell Street to the very top of 5.5 acres, right? They own the whole lot, right? And this is again problem with and of course they've just got planning permission for what? Shops and hotels, no residential. So there's only, can you imagine this? On Dublin's main thoroughfare, O'Connell Street, there is one remaining resident, one person living there. And since the last census, the resident population of O'Connell Street has halved because some fella died. There was only 2. If the state were to go to Hammerson and say, look, we have a better idea. We will buy this site from you and we will create 1,000 apartments, 1,500 apartments in that area. You suddenly then repopulate O'Connell Street. You have 1,000 or 2,000 residents.
Can you not just refuse planning permission for anything other than residential?
A, you can, but they haven't done that. But B, I think you create an alternative. You say, okay, well, look, you are a private company that has spent a long time building up this portfolio, which is legal, but socially kind of reprehensible, right? And when I say socially reprehensible, I don't mean the people who built up the portfolio. It's the people who are running the city should say, hold on, this is a bit stupid, right?
Yeah.
We know that more and more shops will kill, not grow or enhance the city, because more and more shops just means more and more tourists, more and more day trippers, more and more commuters, right?
But people shop differently now as well. So, people are buying more online. I find myself doing that, but, and they might use a retail outlet to, try on a jacket to see if it fits or, get the right size. And then head
And
off
then
and
go online. Yeah.
yeah,
Now you've revealed your shopping patterns to the whole world, John Davis. But just think about it, right? The
yeah,
state comes in and buys that site from them, and then goes to a developer, a number of good developers, and tenders that out and says, "Build me a mix of socially affordable housing and private housing,
yeah,
as the Danes do, as the Dutch do, as the Swedes do, okay, in the area, with the explicit objective of repopulating the North Inner City."
yeah.
So you get people on the property ladder with a stake in the area, and away you go.
Yeah. Can I just ask you though? I mean, and we've said it on the podcast that we need in around 50 to 60,000 houses. The specific number is debated. In the UK, they're talking about 200,000 houses per year for the next while. And then the argument always comes back that, well, actually, we don't have enough workers. We don't have enough builders to actually physically build this stuff. Then you also have the, and I don't know what the specific figures are, but the allegedly thousands of single males coming in to the country. If these guys are coming in, claiming asylum legitimately,
Or illegitimately.
yeah, maybe the condition of coming into the country is to train up as a builder, get out
As a
there
brickie.
and as a brickie. Absolutely. I'm sure a lot of them are skilled anyway, but put them to work rather than having them hanging around and people getting worried about them,
I think
getting up to no good or whatever.
I think you're absolutely right. I think if you wanted to change the conversation about immigration in Ireland,
Mm,
you would make it very evident that immigrants are contributing
yes.
to the society, or to be more brutalist, immigrants are proving a solution to a problem. And
Yeah.
as you said, the problem is not enough, basically, fellas working on sites. I think it's absolutely legitimate to say, here we go. Look, on the one hand, Irish citizenship is worth a huge amount to you, which is why you're here. But in actual fact, the condition of this is, as you say, you do a year working in some area.
And I'd say a lot of the guys would prefer to be working anyway.
Of course they would. Like, I mean, when we were kids, I lasted a morning on a building site in London. I was so bad. A morning, though, was quite good.
Your hands are too soft, Max.
Hands were too soft. But you'd turn up at the site and you'd look for a job. And
Yeah.
they'd say, fine, start lifting those blocks or be a brickie's mate or whatever it
Yeah.
happens to be. And away you went.
Yeah.
Now, actually, a mate of ours on that same
Rog.
site. Yeah. He got run out of the site for reading the Guardian. But anyway, the point is, you're absolutely right. I mean, again, if there's a problem, fix it. If there's a problem, find a solution. If
Yeah.
all these young fellas who are coming in here looking for asylum in their tents say, listen, great, off you go and work, and then we'll process it. And I don't think that anyone can underestimate the positive impact that would have on the perception of immigrants, foreign folk, etc., etc., etc. I really don't,
Yeah.
because at the moment, as you said, the whole narrative is North Inner City, whether this is right or not, it is the narrative that's taken hold, is full of immigrant young men who are a threat to the local community.
Yeah.
If that were changed, the North Inner City is full of immigrant young men who are building a new community.
Yes.
That would be a completely
Yeah.
different narrative.
And
So I
they
think
also have a stake in society as well.
all that sort of stuff. So, but again, those sort of the homes, our idea, the central idea, we come back to it, is more citizens create a vibrant city.
Mm.
Less citizens create a dead city. And a dead city is a dangerous city, because a dead city is a dark city with not enough people on the streets. And you take the people off the streets and people get scared. And then, of course, the requirement is more guards on the street. And the last thing you want to have is the place looking like a police state in lockdown.
Mm.
And that's one of the problems with American cities.
Yeah, and of course, Mike, the more run down a place is, the more unsafe it feels. It's like that broken window theory that you've spoken about before. But, I find, and this is a personal thing for me, I love Georgian Dublin. I love the Merrion Squares and but there's big parts of Dublin that are Georgian as well, that are completely run down, that need to be revamped. I don't see why we need to keep or preserve that Georgian Dublin.
Well, look, here's an idea. I take your point. Interestingly, the metropolitan area of Tokyo, Yokohama has 33 million people living in it.
Mind-boggling, isn't it?
That is the same area as Dublin to Portlaoise. And what do we have? About 4 apple greens, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So how do the Japanese do it? They do it by having a healthy disregard for architectural heritage. To
Yeah.
your point, they
Yeah.
knock things down.
Yeah.
The Japanese housing stock is replaced every 30 or 40 years. They just knock it down and build new stuff, which means that urban Japan looks really weird
Yes.
because
yeah,
there's no real sense of a plan because there isn't a plan.
Yeah. But it has
It's
its own vibe at the same time.
It's a very futuristic looking place because it isn't hamstrung by the tyranny of nostalgia.
Yeah.
And the problem with Ireland is we're hamstrung by the tyranny of nostalgia without doing anything to make the nostalgia live.
Well, exactly. If we could
Right?
make it work, fantastic. If it's not working,
Here's an idea, John. The key to economics is incentives. How do I change people's behavior? You incentivize good behavior over bad behavior. Bad behavior is leaving dilapidated buildings, leaving vacant sites, allowing your building to become derelict. That is bad behavior. I know, as I've said in the podcast before, I think it's bad social behavior.
yeah.
So how do you incentivize good behavior? Now, good behavior is filling in the site, is building a new, it's refurbishing the Georgian building that you're speaking of, John, that's dilapidated and falling down, right?
Yeah.
It is as simple as a lick of paint on something. It's changing the environment that you are in for the better. So how do you do that, right? This is where we're going to adopt the radio program approach to urban development, John, right?
Okay,
Right?
go on. Explain this.
So this is a left field one, so hold your horses.
Right,
So
right.
Irish commercial radio station at the moment, if you turn on the radio now, there's all these bloody competitions of win 20 grand, win 30 grand, you know?
Yes.
Now, this is a very sneaky way of raising revenue. It's based on the lotto idea that if you think you are in with the chance of winning, let's say, 20 grand or 30 grand or 40 grand or 100 grand, whatever it is,
Yeah.
you're going to ring up the radio station. But the catch is, of course, the texts cost, I don't know, €2.
250, yeah, something like that.
250. So very, very quickly, as you get tens of thousands of people paying 250, what looks like a giveaway is actually a heist.
Yeah, yeah. It's a huge money spinner.
It's a huge amount. So take that example. So what is incentivizing people to play and change their behavior is the possibility of winning an amount of money that is so significant, it could change your life. So for example, if the amount of money on offer was £1,000, people wouldn't be bothered. But 100 grand, that can change your life. So take that model of human behavior, of psychology, and apply it now to dilapidation. Could you imagine if the state, Dublin City Council, said, every year we are going to give €1 million tax-free to the owner of the best urban redevelopment of a shop front and or a dilapidated building. Now, how you would do this, how you'd finance this. So suddenly everybody who owns a dilapidated building would say, if I get a couple of lads in there to do this up and we go for part of this competition, we could be in with the chance of winning €1 million tax-free and have a building that's worth much more money.
Yeah.
Because it's now done up. How would you pay for this, of course, is that as more and more people begin to go for the €1 million prize, you get more and more builders. You get buying paint, you get buying interiors, you get much more activity. That, of course, is taxed at the VAT rate of 15 to 20% or 15 to 30%. Very soon, these things become self-financing because the extra economic activity generated by the incentive creates the tax revenue to finance the incentive.
Yeah.
Exactly like Bar Radio's idea. The more people giving in the 250, suddenly giving away 100 grand looks like a giveaway, but you've actually making a fortune.
Yeah. But of course, this is only targeting people who own property. So people who already have assets.
Yeah, people who already have assets, right? But they're the people that you need to incentivize to actually do something with the property. And then you make it an event. It's a national event like the lotto. And people will be waiting to see who wins on our street the €1,000,000,
Yeah.
right? And this way, street by street, building by building, zone by zone, you begin to refurbish the city, not by the state saying, we're going to go and change the world, but actually by incentivizing the local owners to change their behavior to good behavior. It becomes self-financing. You also have an event. It's like a big media event. It'll be like, dun, 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 dun. You'd announce it in the
More
late or
Dermot
something.
Bannon programs.
But use the mechanisms by which the people of Ireland come together, whatever they happen to be,
Yeah.
right? So when you stand back and you look at Dublin City, it needs money from the state. We have 13 billion from Apple sitting doing nothing. Put $1 billion into the state coffers, the council coffers, to buy properties, first of all, to sell to developers, number one, to build.
Yeah.
Create an epic, and when I say epic, it's these extreme positive incentives for change to basically get people taking care of their own properties. And 3, send out a signal to the rest of the country and the rest of the world that the dilapidation of Dublin 1, which has been ongoing for 100 years, stops now. Do those 3 things, and there's no reason why Dublin's inner city, or inner cities all over the world, can't reinvent themselves.